Before we dive into this episode together, I want to let you know where you can find all the episodes of History As It Happens, and that would be historyasithappens.com or wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find my recent conversations about Viktor Orban's Hungary, whether we're reliving the 1850s, and the similarities between Vietnam and Afghanistan among the 61 episodes we've produced so far. New episodes every Tuesday and Thursday. historyasithappens.com. Click the RSS button to subscribe. And now, History As It Happens, August 17th, 2021. Charlottesville says goodbye to the Confederacy.
We are so far from the perfect union, yet one step closer today as these two statues come down.
4 summers ago, our nation was aghast as neo-Nazis and white supremacists marched to defend Confederate statues. Today, Generals Lee and Jackson are gone, and unlike 2017, there was peace in the streets as the statues were taken down. But our past remains a battlefield. The Confederacy is dead but not completely buried, and the fight over statues is moving to other terrain. That's next, as we report History As It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
Will we be the generation that finally wipes out the stain of racism?
As we debate in America whether critical race theory, actual history, can be taught.
They're prohibiting teachers from compelling students to do X, Y, and Z. You went through elementary and high school. How many things were you compelled to believe?
You know how certain events just stick in your mind? The word unforgettable is overused these days, but what happened in early August 2017 in Charlottesville, Virginia, still resonates.
Breaking news, a horrific scene in Charlottesville, Virginia, a white nationalist rally that descended into deadly violence and chaos.
Replace us! You will not replace us! You will not replace us!
But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides. You had people in that group, excuse me, I saw the same pictures as you did. You had people in that group that were there to protest the taking down of, to them, a very, very important statue and the renaming of a park from Robert E. Lee to another name.
It was a defining moment of Donald Trump's early presidency. His equivocating remarks, white nationalists waving swastikas, fighting left-wing counter-protesters in the streets like a scene from the late Weimar Republic. And was all sparked by a statue or efforts to remove a statue that drew the protesters to Charlottesville 4 summers ago, the figure of General Robert E. Lee, erected in 1924 and celebrated by the Ku Klux Klan.
It's important because it's the hint to anybody who has to scratch their head. It's the hint that this is not really about the Civil War. This is not really about the heroism of Confederate generals.
James Grossman is our guest today. He is the executive director of the American Historical Association. In an essay titled Whose Memory, Whose Monuments? History, Commemoration, and the Struggle for an Ethical Past, Grossman writes, that which is memorialized and that which is left to popular memory are not accidental. Indeed, we're going to talk about when and why Confederate monuments were put up, why to this day so many Americans do not fully understand slavery was the primary cause of the Civil War, how all that lost cause mythology permeated textbooks for generations, and why the ways we interpret the past remain so contentious. None of it is accidental. The stories we tell about our past come from something. Charlottesville Mayor Nakia Walker understands this. Here she is at a news conference in July, moments before workers took down the statues of Lee and Jackson.
As we debate in America whether critical race theory, actual history, can be taught, our community battles with the falsities that have created to enshrine and preserve whiteness as supreme. Taking down the statue is one small step closer to the goal of helping Charlottesville, Virginia, and America grapple with its sin of being willing to destroy black people. We are so far from the perfect union, yet one step closer today as these two statues come down.
Now, maybe you're saying, what's the big deal? It's a couple of statues. But you might also say that it's an opportunity to learn, to understand why these monuments mean so much to their defenders and their critics. James Grossman has taught at the University of California, San Diego and the University of Chicago. He is an expert on the American South, slavery, and U.S. social, labor, and urban history. And as mentioned, he is now the executive director of the American Historical Association. James Grossman, welcome.
Thank you for inviting me. Look forward to our conversation.
So, James, the Unite the Right rally was 4 years ago, and just a few weeks ago, the statues of General Lee and Jackson finally came down. So why don't we start with that? Can that be considered progress right now?
Well, it's a sign of progress if you have a very low bar as to what progress is. And on these sorts of issues, quite frankly, for much of American history, there was a very low bar for what constituted progress because there was so little of what we would call progress. So little changed over time. And so if you're an incrementalist in general, like I am, this does represent progress, but of a very minimal sort. Taking down statues does not necessarily mean changing structures, changing laws, changing attitudes, changing institutions. And in some ways, one of the fears that I and many other people have is that taking down statues might be seen as enough, might be seen as sufficient progress that people could clap their hands and say, okay, we did it. Now let's move on to something else. And in point of fact, taking down statues doesn't mean a hell of a lot if you don't change institutions, structures, and culture.
Well, that's the hard part, right?
That's the hard part. Absolutely, that's the hard part, but it's also the essential part. If you don't change institutions, cultures, and structures and processes, then you're not going to make a hell of a lot of difference.
Although it's been pretty hard just getting the statues down, too.
Yes, it has been very hard, and the statues do matter. Statues represent statements about a community's values. Statues represent statements about what a community honors, what a community thinks is worthy, and when you take it down, unworthy. But when you see a statue, you're looking at that and you say, this is what this community thinks is important and honorable. Therefore, to have statues all over the country of people who committed treason on behalf of the right of some people to own, buy, and sell other people, that's not a real positive representation of the values that we honor.
So at the rally 4 years ago, there wasn't just Confederate iconography. There were also neo-Nazis, sort of a weird historical allegiance there between neo-Confederates and neo-Nazis. And I wondered, because of how shocking that was, if that moment wasn't a tipping point. A watershed moment is probably overstating the case, but I'm wondering if you agree if the rally and the aftermath proved to be a tipping point or a final push for efforts to remove these statues once and for all. Am I overstating the case?
That's possible. I think the neo-Nazi symbolism probably scared some people who before that would say, oh, this is really just people's heritage. Even the Confederate flags didn't seem to bother a hell of a lot of people for a long time. But neo-Nazi symbolism might well have woken some people up. And in some ways, that's misleading in the sense that if we see the neo-Nazi presence too centrally, what we miss is the presence of the respectable white middle, upper middle class in participation. Respectable white people have been participating in these sorts of things since the period of the Ku Klux Klan. It used to be people thought that the Klan was riffraff, that the Klan was rejected by the respectable business class. And we later learned through better historical work, new documents, what we call revisionism, to be honest, that the Klan, in fact, had considerable participation from the most respectable people in most southern towns and cities. I think we're seeing the same thing here. And if you don't believe that, take a look at the wonderful data we have from the January 6th event. And we realize that people who participate in things that we dismiss as work of the riffraff, in fact, are our respectable neighbors.
So let's talk about those statues in Charlottesville. Jackson's was unveiled in 1921, General Lee's in 1924. So we're talking more than a half century after the end of the Civil War, about 40 years after the end of Reconstruction. Why is that important to understanding the reasons why those statues were put up in the first place?
It's important because it's the hint to anybody who has to scratch their head. It's the hint that this is not really about the Civil War. This is not really about the heroism of Confederate generals. That this is really about legitimating and perpetuating ideas and structures of race that in the 1920s had burrowed themselves into Southern culture. You say, well, why did these things start happening in the 1890s and continue into the 1920s and beyond? Well, it's because this was a period when Southern states were deeply invested in building and maintaining the Jim Crow regime. That's what these statues represent. These statues represent a legitimation of a way of life. Aside from the chronology, which, when people say, well, this was to honor our heroes. Well, if it was to honor your heroes, my friend, then why didn't you put them up in 1870? But even with that, there's another smoking gun here. And that is, it's not just the chronology, it's the personnel. Have you ever seen a statue of General Longstreet?
I don't know.
General Longstreet was a very skilled military leader, among the best of the Southern generals. Why aren't there statues to General Longstreet?
Because, let me take a guess, he renounced the Confederacy after the war?
You got it. He was in favor of black suffrage by the 1870s.
Wow.
So if this was really about Civil War heroes, we would see General Longstreet, but we don't. And that's because this has nothing to do with the Civil War other than as, in essence, a tool for honoring a way of life that has no reason to be honored in our culture, our politics, or our society. That's what this was all about. If you were to say, well, these people, were honorable people, they did other things, they just happened to be slaveholders. Stonewall Jackson did nothing in his life that deserved being honored on the level that he was other than military leadership. So you can't make that excuse. And then it becomes even more obvious when you look at some of the other statue building and especially the school renamings. When do the school renamings happen?
I'm assuming around the same time?
Nope. The school renamings happen after Brown.
Brown versus Board of Education.
After 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, during the period when many Southern communities are engaged in massive resistance, where they are creating the segregation academies, but they are renaming schools for Confederate figures, Confederate leaders, as again, it's a symbolic act. That's what statues are. It's what namings are. They are ways in which the community is symbolically representing their values.
These statues were, in my view, a reassertion of white supremacy in the South. They symbolize lost cause mythology. They're a way of telling people, well, we might have lost the war, but we aren't surrendering.
It's not just we aren't surrendering, we haven't surrendered. So yes, it's a way of saying we haven't surrendered and we're not gonna. What then begins to happen beginning in the 1880s and then more in the 1890s is, and now we're going to instantiate our values and the society in which we honor. It's not just the generals. Drive around the South and you see courthouses all over the place that have anonymous Confederate veterans, Confederate soldiers on horseback, as a way of saying these are our community's heroes.
Well, someone might be forgiven for not realizing the origins of these statues when you merely see them out in public because they've outlived Jim Crow. We've made substantial progress toward racial equality. I don't want to overstate the case, but we had the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1964, 1965. So the statues are, in a way, anachronistic. They were put in place when Jim Crow was, what's the right term? Not de facto, de jure.
Jim Crow in the South is de jure. That's the whole point. The difference between the South and the North at that time was if you owned a bus company in the South, you were required to segregate. If you owned a bus company in a northern city, you were not required to segregate. You can get away with it, and there would be pressure on you. But in the South, it didn't matter whether you wanted to or not. It was a law that required you. Not a law that permitted it, but a law that required it. And to say that, well, this is anachronism because this is all gone, in a way, it makes no sense because it's not gone. First of all, disfranchisement in the 1890s was a central part of the Jim Crow regime that is being justified by these statutes. What was the greatest justification for disfranchisement in the 1890s?
It was to return white power to the South.
Nope. The greatest justification that was used was election fraud.
Oh, the justification for doing it.
Justification for disfranchisement was election fraud. Well, if that's not familiar to anybody who reads any newspaper or listens to any news source that has any integrity, journalistic integrity whatsoever, then we know that when someone screams election fraud, we have to step back and say, why are they doing that? What is the purpose? Because we also know, and this is historical fact, it is not theory, the evidence is very clear that there has been very little election fraud in these specific situations. If you want to find election fraud in the 1890s and especially the early 20th century, you can find election fraud most in northern cities where machines like Tammany Hall are, in essence, stuffing ballot boxes. There's tremendous evidence. It's really fascinating about how Tammany Hall fought off the socialists in the early 20th century in New York. There is documented election fraud. There is documented election fraud all over rural America. I know of one county in New York because I did some work there where basically any farmer who didn't show up, someone gave him a call in the late afternoon and said, should we vote for you? Should we take care of it for you? There was not a hell of a lot of election fraud in Reconstruction. So this isn't dead. It's not anachronistic. We're seeing it all around us. Second of all, segregation included housing segregation. What's the lasting impact of housing segregation? The lasting impact of housing, one of the lasting impacts is if I bought property, let's say my parents bought a house in the 1950s and kept that house until they died a half century later. That's my inheritance. It's a hell of a lot of money sitting there. Now, it didn't happen to me actually because my mother needed the money. But for white people, the increase in value in real estate is a considerable part of the increase in wealth and the transfer of wealth from one generation to the other. Well, if you own real estate in a black neighborhood, you don't have that kind of increase in wealth. Property values do not rise in the same way. And that has to do with various mechanisms of segregation, especially including the practice of redlining. We all know, anybody who's taken Econ 102, microeconomics, knows that if you don't provide capital, you can't provide increase in value very easily. And mortgages were harder to get in black neighborhoods for 30, 40, 50 years. So that's the impact of segregation. It's the impact of racist practices. So this is not anachronistic. Even if the practices are gone, we are living with the results.
And another point to make about the claim that these statues are about Southern heritage. In 1924, before the Lee statue was unveiled, a certain group held a parade there in Charlottesville to celebrate. That group's name? The Ku Klux Klan. So these statues matter in another way, too. They become an obstacle to an accurate reading of our past. And you've written about this at length, of course. When someone sees, for instance, a statue of General Lee, they might think, well, maybe his cause wasn't so bad after all. I mean, they are honoring him with a statue, you know what I mean? There have been a number of polls asking Americans if slavery was the main cause of the Civil War. And the results are fairly dismaying. One recent poll found that only 52% of Americans say slavery was the primary cause of the Civil War. Why is this relevant to our discussion?
Well, first of all, if you don't understand that slavery was central to the cause of the Civil War, then you don't understand what these men were fighting for. Heroism is a really interesting and complex concept. And there are no easy answers to the concept of heroism. If you do something that is physically brave in the interest of something that is despicable, are you a hero? That's an interesting question. If I'm a Nazi soldier and I do something brave and save 5 lives of my fellow soldiers, is that a heroic act? This is the kind of question, in fact, that our students ought to be talking about in school. And if you acknowledge that the Civil War was about slavery, that gives you a way of using that statue in front of the courthouse in a really interesting way in school. Because even an elementary school teacher can say to the kids, okay, that statue that's in front of the courthouse, and by the way, we can move those into museums easily enough, but that statue that used to be in front of our courthouse was honoring the average soldier for his bravery. I think elementary and middle school kids can have a discussion about whether you can honor someone for bravery on behalf of a cause that is inhumane. And that gets into the whole question about leadership, about rank and file, but that's really what's going on here. If you read the Articles of Secession, the Declarations of Secession, if you read the speech, the famous cornerstone speech by the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stevens, they make it very clear. We are doing this to defend our right in slaves, to defend our property rights. Well, nobody was going to take their land away from them. That was not what they were defending. They were defending the right to own human property.
So why are these poll numbers still so low then, here in the year 2021?
Because it takes a long time for professional historical scholarship to make its way into classrooms in every corner of the United States. But they're also low because of political interference. The interest of white politicians in various parts of the country, I think if you look at the regional breakdown for the data that you're looking at, you'll see that this is more common in the South, although it's also present elsewhere. The interference by politicians who have a stake in maintaining, first of all, that notion of what it means to be an American, and second of all, in perpetuating culture wars, trying to distract Americans from real political issues like 615,000 people dying already of COVID. We have politicians who would rather jump up and down to defend the right and the obligation of teachers to teach the Civil War a certain way than to teach the kids how to read statistics.
I'm going to ask you about the current battle over critical race theory and related issues in a moment, but one other question about the statues and monuments. Where should they be relocated to? Museums, Civil War battlefields?
I think that's what communities ought to be debating. That's what civic culture should be about, the role of democracy in making those decisions. If you've got a community that has these statues, why not have a discussion at a school board meeting with a few historians present who don't make decisions but say, well, let me tell you about the statues, let me tell you when they were built, let me tell you why they were built, and what the difference is between history and heritage. You can have this conversation in social studies classes, high school history classes. Now, my recommendation for the state of Georgia, for example, would be to take all these statues and haul them to Stone Mountain. Stone Mountain has the most difficult to eradicate Confederate monument in the country, probably. The whole side of the mountain has Confederate generals on their horses, right? There's a lot of land there. You could take probably every statue, Confederate statue in the state of Georgia, haul it to Stone Mountain in that park, build 100% more statues and monuments that look at history in a different way, and create an opportunity for the public to learn about the nature of monuments, the nature of statuary, Civil War history, Georgia history, all sorts of stuff you could do by making, in essence, an outdoor museum out of the statuary. It's not destroying our history. In fact, it's using these as objects to talk about history. So that's my solution.
I've always just found it weird on a basic level that people who consider themselves patriotic citizens of the United States of America continue to embrace, well, the losers in a terrible Civil War who represented the Confederate States of America.
Yeah, it's a little bizarre.
Yeah. And especially bizarre are the comparisons between Donald Trump and Abraham Lincoln, people who compare Trump favorably to Lincoln, Trump defending Confederate monuments and military bases named after Confederates. I think Abraham Lincoln would have a problem with that, but not to digress. Let's move on to your profession. The teaching profession is now a battlefield. Many states are banning what they call critical race theory from classrooms, and many teachers are worried that basically could cover everything. Am I allowed to bring up systemic racism in the United States? Jim Crow was systemic racism.
First, it makes it impossible to teach good history. There's an irony. In one state, at least, They paired this legislation, I don't think it passed, with a requirement to teach the Holocaust. How can you teach the Holocaust without explaining long traditions and institutionalized practices of anti-Semitism, a form of racism, in Germany? You can't. The Nazis didn't just spring up out of nowhere. Not only that, but one of the places the Nazis got their ideas about legislation was they visited the United States. They read Jim Crow laws. They read American racist literature. So it's very difficult to talk about how the Nazis developed some of their institutions without understanding what they learned from us. And if you say they learned it from us, you're probably violating some of these statutes. The second is these statutes are an old trick. As a journalist, you are familiar with the practice of push polling, right? You ask a question, and in fact, you're not really interested in the answer to the question. You're using the asking of the question to frame someone's opinion, to have an impact on their opinion. That's what some of these laws are. If you read these laws carefully, especially these bullet points in these laws, the things that are forbidden, most of these things that are being prohibited, nobody does. They're prohibiting teachers from compelling students to do X, Y, and Z. You went through elementary and high school. How many things were you compelled to believe? So if you look carefully at these laws, what they're doing is prohibiting things that in fact are not happening, but by putting it in the law, they're convincing people that this terrible stuff is happening. And you've got to rise up against it, just like you've got to rise up against requiring masks. I mean, they're tying it to the same thing, to the force of the state. So that's a second piece of this. A third piece of it is really interesting because some of these laws are saying, don't teach theory, you can teach only facts. Well, I'm good with that. You don't have to teach something called critical race theory to explain how Jim Crow institutions, how continuing racism is deeply implicated in American institutions and American culture. I think most teachers are fine with teaching the facts. It's only when they say, teach the facts, but you can't teach that fact, that there's a problem. So in essence, what's really interesting here is that this is an invented crisis. Most of what these laws prohibited isn't being done. And much of what these laws prohibit is the simple teaching of historical fact. There's nothing to do with critical race theory. It has nothing to do with the 1619 Project. And by the way, we've seen this before. We've seen this before in the 1950s when you saw these pamphlets that said, if your child's teacher is using these 10 phrases, they must be a communist. And there were people running around the country in the 1950s absolutely panicked at the teaching of communism in American schools. Well, that generation is people my age, and I can tell you that most people my age are not communists. Obviously, there wasn't that big a problem.
Maybe you're just a fellow traveler. Kidding.
That's possible.
You brought up the 1619 Project. I have done a couple of podcast episodes about it. I've spoken to Sean Wilentz and Leslie Harris. There are some real problems with that. I don't want to digress about 1619, but did make some mistakes about the American Revolution. It's not a work of history, so maybe it's not fair to judge it as one, but it is part of our culture wars.
Of course it is. And works of history as well as works of journalism are revised. Did you take economics in college?
No.
Okay.
No.
If you had, you would have used a textbook by Robert Samuelson. Samuelson is probably in its 55th edition right now. Aside from the fact that the publisher and Samuelson can make a little more money, why do you have to keep changing it? You have to keep changing it because we learn. We learn that something that someone said 5 years ago isn't quite straight with the evidence. So we revise. 1619 Project, some of it is very helpful and will work its way into the curriculum. And some of it, people will scratch their head and say, no, I don't think so. And it works its way out of the curriculum. But there's a basic premise in that project that bugs the hell out of people that is incontrovertible. And that is that the founders, the people who wrote the founding documents, were people deeply enmeshed in a slave society. That doesn't mean that you say that these are documents meant to defend slavery. It doesn't mean that you make comments about these people's hypocrisy, their character, whatever. I mean, you can. That's a great thing for students to discuss. But there's an incontrovertible fact. James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, people from the North are in a different kind of society that does own slaves. Most of the people, the Virginians, who were so influential in writing those documents, grew up in a world in which it was considered normal, legitimate, desirable for one group of people to own, buy, and sell another group of people. And that structure had existed for 150 years. How can you say these documents are not influenced by that?
So you brought up revisionism. It was the Dunning School that dominated the academic understanding of the Civil War and the Reconstruction period. And it was the Dunning School that needed to be revised in order for us to get to our current understanding of the Civil War, right?
Yes, and our current understanding will be revised, I assure you, in 25 or 50 years.
Can you briefly tell our listeners what the Dunning School was and why it was so important?
Sure. The Dunning School was a group of historians, and it's called the Dunning School because the major figure who trained many of these students at Columbia was a historian named Dunning. William Archibald Dunning was his name. These were historians who wrote histories of the Civil War and Reconstruction that, in essence, accepted the Southern view of that period. They saw Reconstruction as corrupt, as a mistake, as a South that had to be redeemed by heroic former slaveholders and allies of former slaveholders. And this interpretation of Southern history dominated the textbooks, classrooms in the United States from the turn of the century right into the 1950s and 60s. The Dunning School interpretation of Reconstruction gets paired with what's called the Phillips School, named after Ulrich Phillips, of slavery. Phillips argued, the metaphor Phillips used was that the plantation was a school and the children were let out of school too early. So planters were paternalists. Planters were people who were, in essence, civilizing the Africans who were brought here by force. That interpretation of slavery was overturned between the mid-1950s and the 1970s by historians, by revisionist historians who looked at the evidence and scratched their head and said, this isn't true. That interpretation of slavery leads logically to an interpretation of Reconstruction, which is Reconstruction was a mistake because these people were not ready for self-government. As Phillips put it, they were let out of school too early. In point of fact, the Reconstruction governments, which were coalitions between Northern Republicans, Southern Unionists who became Republicans, white Unionists, and Black Southerners, former free blacks and former slaves, those were the most honest governments the South had for centuries in our history. When we talk about revisionist history, often what revisionist history is, historians, in part by asking new questions, sometimes uncover new evidence that we didn't have before, and sometimes read old evidence differently. What historians actually started to do was look at the budgets in these states. They started looking at the contracts, and what they realized was that what corruption there was actually rather thin. And this is tied again, this is why this still matters, to this notion of voting fraud. The Reconstruction governments were not that corrupt. There was not that much fraud. And the overturning of Reconstruction was not about corruption, really. It was about restoring white supremacy. And the overturning of those Reconstruction governments was done by force. We had the evidence in front of us all the time. The Dunning School did not read the Klan hearings. You can read very easily the evidence that describes the ways in which Reconstruction governments were overthrown by terrorist force. That's all you can describe it as. So that's the overturning of the Dunning School. And I should emphasize here, though, by the way, that although the Phillips School and the Dunning School were overturned by professional historians in the 1960s especially, Black historians had been writing Southern history in a different vein for decades. W.E.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction, written in the 1930s, made the argument that the white historians made 3 decades later and was finally inscribed in the textbooks.
And Dunning, again, was Columbia University, not just some guy with an internet connection.
No.
Good segue into my next question for you. When it comes to this battle over education, the survivors of the Confederacy, the lost cause mythologizers, they understood better than anybody that the education system is where you go to win your battle, so to speak, to inculcate the future generations. Children were always present at the monument unveiling ceremonies. James McPherson wrote, so that the rising generation with no personal memories of the war would understand the heroism of their fathers. The United Daughters of the Confederacy organized children auxiliaries. The daughters, as well as veterans groups, formed historian committees in the 1890s or historical committees in the 1890s. They published textbooks, and these textbooks found their way into America's schools. And I guess you could say the rest was history, right?
That's right. They had it right. They understood how you inculcate values. So it's not just the children being present at those ceremonies. That's absolutely right. But also, as I mentioned earlier, the existence of the statue itself. I'm a parent. I walk past a statue every day, and my kid says, "Who's that?" Now, most parents have not read W.E.B. Du Bois in the 1940s and the 1950s. They had the Dunning School in their high school history textbook, and maybe they've seen Gone with the Wind. So between popular culture and the experts they have, they explain to this kid who this was, why this person was a hero. This black parent who walks past with their kids, they've got a serious problem because they've got to explain to their kids why their community is honoring someone who's defending the enslavement of their ancestors. Which is why, by the way, black communities wanted these statues torn down a long time ago. There's a myth right now that the movement to destroy these statues is new, that it starts in the last decade because we've seen it become more successful. That's not true. The movement to destroy these statues begins when they go up, but it's limited in most places to black people. From the beginning are saying, get rid of this. This is not who we should be. These people committed treason. How many countries have statues of people who committed treason?
Or lost a civil war that tried to destroy the country, right?
Well, that's the commission of treason. Lost a war is, in a sense, a euphemism that softens what these people did. It's the same way in which I never, when I'm talking to a public audience, I never refer to the Union Army. The Union Army and the Confederate Army imply these are two equal forces. They are not. There is the Confederate Army, the Army of the Confederacy, and there is the Army of the United States of America. And anybody who took up a rifle and shot at a soldier who was part of, not the Union Army, but the Army of the United States of America, was in essence trying to kill a soldier who was fighting for the United States of America. And if that person had taken an oath as a graduate of West Point, as a member of Congress, a public official, that's treason.
James Grossman of the American Historical Association. Your comments remind us of the importance of language. In this case, normalizing treason as we continue to bury the lost cause. On the next episode of History as It Happens, we return to Afghanistan.
Our mission in Afghanistan was never supposed to have been nation building. It was never supposed to be creating a unified, centralized democracy.
The sudden collapse of Kabul has led to bipartisan criticism of President Biden, second-guessing, and accusations of betrayal. Why did Afghanistan's army fail to resist the Taliban? Why did America lose another war? That's next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.